Hey, welcome back to another episode of Build to Sell with JB. I'm so excited today because I've got a really good friend and compadre and just a guy who you meet a lot of people in this industry who do similar things to what we do. And most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time you look and you find them to be different in the way they view the world and the value that they bring and the way that they want to work with others than you do. But Nick and I met, quite a while ago and have had some really great opportunities to just get to know each other. And he's a guy that I believe just does it the right way and has a similar worldview, wanting to really bring value. And he's got an incredible story, an incredible background. So he also is the host of Scale Up, which is, it was, Nick, I don't know if it still is, but one of the top-rated business podcasts in the UK. And he's got such an interesting backstory and background with some of the folks that he's worked with and the way that he's done it that I'm really excited to get into it. So, Nick, thank you so much for joining and spending some time with me.
What a lovely intro.
And also, maybe the most important thing, he is a mutual fan of the greatest basketball team in the world, our Boston Celtics.
That's right. Right behind me, as you can see just over the shoulder there, we have Larry the Legend Bird.
I was going to say, is that Larry?
Oh, yeah.
I love it.
That was my wedding gift. So my wife and I got married sort of 16 years ago, and she gave that to me the day before our wedding.
That's a keeper. That's a keeper right there.
I know. Tell me about it. So it's great. And also the cool thing, and this is, I managed to go and see them win in the finals this past year, which was
we were messaging back and forth during that.
Incredible. But
that was the good stuff.
But yeah, I mean, to start off on the podcast thing. So yeah, my show initially was called Scale Up Your Business back in 2019 when I launched it. And at that point, it went to number one in the UK and stayed there for a little while before this guy called Stephen Bartlett launched Diary of a CEO. And that's now like the biggest podcast in the world. But what happened, which is interesting, is I left the world of private equity. I started that podcast because I needed to do something for two reasons. One, I wanted to give back and share all the different experiences with what I'd gone through in private equity. But I also wanted to start to build a bit of a brand for myself to be able to create a new sort of trajectory on working for myself and being entrepreneurial. And because it was so cathartic and because I shared so many stories that I'd normally hidden stories, I think that's what got it to being very popular, that and the name. The name Scale Up back in 2019, no one talked about scale up like they do now. So it was kind of I was one of the first people to talk about that as a business growth concept.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what I've always enjoyed about your story, other than just who you are and the neat things that you've done, is you were in this rare situation where you currently help business owners to really grow and scale their business, but you do it in a very intentional way with them. But what's fascinating about your story is that you used to be on sort of the other side of the table, and what I call you were a pipe hitter. You really were one of these guys that were in a role in private equity that your entire job, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is my view as being on the other side of that table a lot. Your job was to really sort of take advantage of business owners. And
I was incentivized to do it. So
yeah, you were incentivized to pay the least amount of money possible for the business and then to go in and grab it. So for you to switch sides is very unique.
Yeah. And it was, there's a lot, people sometimes say that, I'm sort of anti that private equity world, but it's actually the opposite because the skills you learn in private equity for growing and scaling companies and where value really sits. Yeah. Which even to this day, when, you can go and read about it, but people still get it wrong and get it confused. But the way they teach you about that is so good. It's like, if we joke about the NBA, it's like playing in the NBA to some extent. It's hard to get in. It's hard to stay, right? You have to be doing certain things, but that's where you can, if you let it, you can compromise your values because they make it very, very hard to leave if you're good. And so, the whole thing about being on that side of the table, it was great when I was doing it. I didn't want to be there any longer. Yeah. And then I made that conscious decision to just work now with entrepreneurs and founders and effectively, I suppose, teach them all the things that I learned from over a decade being in that industry.
Mm. Now, what are some of the things that stick out that maybe, it's always that phrase, like you don't know what you don't know. And business owners, a lot of them, the ideal in their mind is I want to just get my business to the point where I could be an attractive exit target for private equity. And they think that that's sort of this golden parachute in their mind, and they idealize a little bit. What are some things that maybe folks don't know that they should?
I think to kick off, because I'm always conscious, I know on a show like this, people are going to have more understanding of private equity because they're probably more interested in M&A and things like that as well. But private equity didn't exist until not in its current guise, sort of 20 odd years ago. It's kind of a newish concept. And actually, when you go to some, still westernized countries, like even places like where I'm from in Australia, private equity is still quite underdeveloped. And what's interesting about private equity is that before it existed as an entity, the opportunities for a business owner to liquidate their assets, to have kind of an exit that could change their life, was so limited. So you either gave the business to your family, right, or you sold it to a partner, or the big ugly gorilla competitor down the road just came and did some sort of corporate takeover thing.
Yeah.
Right. And private equity these days, and this is the bit that I think people don't appreciate, is that, and I forget the exact statistic, but something like in the next decade, 70% of all 8 and 9 figure transactions will be private equity transactions, meaning that they're either directly going to be buying a small business, or they're going to have bought a business that's going to buy a small business.
Yeah.
And that's going to create so many millionaires that didn't exist beforehand. So I think the first point I want to kind of get across to your question is you have to firstly learn to appreciate what opportunity that's given for wealth creation, right? Really appreciate it. And the second thing is you need to learn how to play the game. Because if you don't know how to play the game, and you talk about this a lot, you are going to get killed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. We share a brain on that. I'm a guy who, you know me, but if you didn't know me, you might assume because of what I've done for a lot of my career that I dislike private equity. Not the case at all. Some really good friends of mine and folks I admire tremendously are private equity folks. And like any industry, there's a spectrum of different types of characters and actors, but you just have to go into it understanding. It's a little bit like the old show. I say old. I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's old, but Looney Tunes, where you have the sheepdog and you have the coyote, and they sort of the clock gets punched and they're trying to kill each other and they're going after each other.
Oh, I love those. I remember those. You're taking me back to my childhood, JB.
Yeah. So then the clock, they clock out. It's over, and they're just like, "Oh, it was a good day, Frank. What do you think about that? Oh, I thought it was a good day. I'll see you tomorrow. Hope you have a great day. How's the family?" And there's a component to that in my experience with private equity. But you make it I think a really important point, which is that if that's the game that you're going to aspire to enter into, you really have to understand what the game really is. And that if you don't, you can find yourself in a really rough situation. So what I would love to know is, you sort of glossed over a little bit. You decided to make the change from private equity and to go into your own business, and you started the podcast, and you've had, tremendous success, which is unsurprising, but I feel like there's probably more that went into you making that decision to leave what you were doing, which probably had some golden handcuff components to it.
Yeah, I can unpack it in a little bit more detail, because I think it's a lesson in understanding purpose as well, right? Yeah. And I find sometimes the business owners that lose sense of purpose and identity, they cloud their vision, and then they start to derail their companies. So it's kind of an important quotient for that as well. Yeah, I mean, the situation was I was all through my corporate career. I started off as an entrepreneur. I started my first business when I was in my sort of late teens, personal training business in Adelaide, South Australia, that I joke that I sold for 3,000 Australian dollars 3 years later.
And 2 kangaroos.
Well, $3,000 now. I don't even think what the hell that's worth. Probably it was worth a little bit more. But yeah, there was kangaroos involved and sharks, because great white sharks are big in South Australia. But anyway, I started this business. It was pretty successful for what it was. It kind of got me through university, where I did a finance and a marketing degree and all those things. And I kind of gave up on it because I thought, maybe the grass is greener if I go into this world of corporate. I think, to be honest with you, I was just scared of trying to make it work. And as a teenager, I was already working more hours than anyone else of my friends, and I just wanted to have some fun and whatever. So I ended up going and working in the lands of media for some massive companies like News International and Getty Images, and did all that.
Oh, Getty Images. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, that was my first foray actually into private equity. So I was hired to come in firstly in a kind of strategic marketing role, but I ended up heading up one of their big divisions. And they were owned at that time. I think they were owned by Hellman Friedman. I can't remember exactly, but there was a transition. We sold the business sort of from one private equity to another private equity. And because I came in and I was doing quite a good job, when you are in a private equity backed business, and you're identified as being quite talented in whatever area, you then get selected, if you like, to do other things, and you get invited to different things. It's almost like being courted. It's a bit weird. I never went to university in America, but I imagine it's like being, is it pledging or something like that?
Yeah, pledging. I was in a fraternity. That's exactly what
there you go. You kind of get selected, right? And so that was my start into private equity. So I was in that world for around 10 years, just over 10 years. And I eventually migrated through the ranks, if you like, to end up running some of these invested businesses. So I was a CEO 4 times in different entities, mainly B2B businesses. And I made some decent cash off that. You always feel, though, that you're never really getting maybe what you think you're going to get. So even, this is the funny bit, like particularly when you're an operating person as opposed to a guy in the firm. So I was in the businesses.
Right.
You get these kind of carrots and incentives and all the various bits, and you kind of make a bit of money through the way, but it's enough to keep you, but it's not enough to make you want to leave, like, because you've made so much money. You see what I mean?
You're out, you're done.
So that's where it's a bit weird. So everyone goes, oh, private equity and all these deals. And I have been involved in, it's about $5 billion worth of deals. And everyone goes, oh, how much money? I'm like, a bit of money, right? Enough that it's a great life, but I'm not a billionaire. I'm not buying the Celtics next week.
Doesn't quite trickle down that way, does it?
No, there are elements where you can orchestrate that when you start to move up the ranks right into the firms, right? The operating partners. And I did that for a little bit of my career, but not a whole heap of it. But anyway, so the final part that I was involved in, I was the CEO of the international division of a business called Ascend Learning, which we sold to Blackstone for just over $2 billion. This was in 2016, 2017. And that was supposed to be a really big deal for me, but it ended up becoming a real car crash. Lots of internal politics, lots of things going on. So I got the transaction happened, but I didn't make as much money as I was supposed to make. And I had a huge fight with some of the other people that were involved there. And the whole thing was very toxic. And one of the issues, I think, was I was still working out of the UK, running one of the businesses in the UK. And all the decision making was happening in Boston. And I was so far removed. So that was going on. At the same time, my father passed away. He came back into my life after being away almost my whole life. He left when I was 2 years of age and then came back in my mid-30s, just before my first daughter was born. And he ended up getting cancer and dying very quickly. So we only had this very limited amount of time together. Yeah. But what was interesting about him is he was a very successful entrepreneur. And I had this night, I know you know the story, but I'll share it here, where this deal was going through with Ascend Learning. I was getting sidelined in that deal. My dad had just passed away. Because he was such a successful entrepreneur, I kind of realized that all of the people that we were taking advantage of all through my career in this were people like my dad. And he'd had a bit of bad luck as well with his businesses and things like that. And I was started to have this real kind of Jerry Maguire moment. Yeah. Where I had to create a new manifesto. And I went to bed one night through all this. And I remember waking up at 3 a.m. and I'd broken the teeth in the right side of my jaw, like not little shards of teeth. And I went to the bathroom and my face was all swollen up, and it was quite shocking. And I ended up going to the dentist, and they said that this is extreme levels of stress. Like, you are living at a point where things are going to start going wrong with you because you have to change. And it was at that point that, this is now we're getting to 2018-ish. Yeah. That point, I called up a friend who was very successful when I was at university. He retired in his early 30s, now has an amazing life, invests in companies, all that sort of stuff. I called him up and said, I need some help. And he said, what's going on? I shared the story. And he said, I'm going to tell you to do something, and you're probably not going to want to do it, but I'm going to insist that you do it. And he said, I want you to go to your computer. I want you to look up Tony Robbins and find out when he's running his next live event in the US. He said, try and do it somewhere out of your country. Go there because it's pretty full on. And I was like, oh, really? He goes, trust me. When I was friends with you back in university, and you were going out playing pool and drinking and all of that, and I was going to these events. I was going to events that he was running. And I was like, oh, okay. He said, everything changed. And the reason that I now have this life where I kind of just do whatever I want, I've been doing that for over a decade, is because of this.
Wow.
So I'll speed this up. I go to Chicago, 2018, June. It's at the United Center. All the Michael Jordan banners are hanging up. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. Sit there for 4 days, and I absolutely change my whole trajectory of thinking.
Wow.
And I start to, a very emotional kind of thing. I remember crying my eyes out through this whole thing. But what I learned there was there's lots of things happen, but there was one quote by Zig Ziglar that came up, which was, if you help enough people get what they want in life, you'll have everything that you want and need in life, something like that. And in the world of private equity, you're not taught to act like that. You're taught to be more machine, right? And all of a sudden I realized, hold on, maybe if I help other people and get this sense of fulfillment in my life, I can have both a fulfillment and I can have achievement. In fact, maybe the achievement's going to feel so much better if I do that. Yeah. And that then spurred the podcast. And then that takes us to the 5 years now of doing what I've been doing, which is very much helping those entrepreneurs create freedom and financial independence. That's what I say my mission is. And I do it through a set of skills that I learned through that world of private equity.
Yeah, man, what a powerful story. And what I'm struck by is, and I've got a different but directionally similar one as to what led me to do what I do, which is somewhat similar to what you do. And what strikes me about it is that it's always sort of a deep reflection and looking into what I have termed in my life is looking into the abyss of your own soul at times and trying to figure out, the essence of a man and who we are and who we're meant to be and how we're meant to go into the world and what we're meant to do. And when you find yourself, and I did, and it sounds like you did as well, when you find yourself pursuing a career path or it can be personal, whatever it is, that is materially different than what you were meant to do and what you were built to do, there's this dynamic tension that's created that for some of us longer than others, but it takes a little while to figure out, why am I feeling this angst and disconnect and stress that manifests in your case physically with, sounds like you're just grinding your teeth in the middle of your sleep because your body is rebelling against, like, hey, no, this is not what Nick Bradley's meant to be. This is not how you're meant to show up in the world and who you're meant to sort of serve. So I'm really struck by that. And what's interesting is the story of getting to know your dad after that absence and building that relationship with him, but also who his identity was. And you having this realization of, well, wait a second, my dad is sort of an avatar of the type of person that when I'm working in private equity, I'm sort of working in the opposite direction of, and I don't like that. It's beautiful, really.
Yeah, it's a real gift of, and it's kind of, how sometimes people say, without being too sort of woo-woo about it, they sort of say that things show up when they need to show up for you, right? And the fact that he showed up and then he passed away and all of that happened, it's kind of weird the way the mix happens. So I needed the lesson at that time, and that was the lesson that happens, right? So, didn't know that necessarily at the time, but now having reflected on it for 6 years, and I haven't really looked back since then, right? So that's what it was.
Yeah, and I'm doing some reverse math in my head with your beautiful children and your wife, and I'm sitting here thinking, for me, I never knew my dad, so I have some similar dad issues,
okay.
but different way. And I don't know that there was a time in my life where I could point to a 1 or 2 year window where I changed more in terms of moving closer to who I was meant to be than when I looked down the barrel of becoming a father myself, with all of those sort of issues built up over my life that I had around that. Did you already have children when this was all going on, or were you about to become a dad?
He came back in. So this is the funny piece of the whole bit. He came back in just before Arabella was born. So the 10-year anniversary of his death is next year.
Yeah. So
he came in, and the reason it happened, I don't think I've actually shared this on a show like this beforehand. It was my wife meddling. So I was adamant for years that I'd never wanted to see him. And It was partly out of respect for my mum and other people who brought me up. And then a few things happens, and my wife was like, "Oh, someone in Scotland," because my dad's half Scottish. So my dad's Scottish, I'm half Scottish. Contacted my wife and said, "Oh, you married to Nicholas Bradley. I'm related to him. I'm his second cousin or something." And my wife goes, "Someone from Scotland's just emailed us saying they're such and such, and they didn't have the same last name."
Probably like a 23andMe thing, like they found you the DNA or something.
It was, I don't know what I think it was some Facebook thing, or who knows what it was. I wasn't doing any I wasn't known publicly. I had no brand. Anyway, it just back to serendipity. It was kind of all that. So she was like, I said, "Oh no, I don't want to meet him. I don't want to." It eventually came to fruition that there was a contact through this person to my dad, and I'm like, "No, don't you dare do anything." So she did. She sent emails to him. She's pregnant at this time, or coming.
A wife move.
I know. It's like, oh god. And she goes, "Oh, you can be so upset with me." But it ended up. We joke about it now. She goes, "Oh, are you still upset that I meddled?" Right? I'm like, maybe.
You got to be careful how you answer that question, because you don't want to give too much power for future events.
No, but the thing about getting to know him, firstly, he was a successful entrepreneur, made me realize that when I started that business back in Adelaide, that I was very entrepreneurial. Maybe I'd repress that. Then seeing him with Arabella over the years that he was alive, up until when she was about 3, that was incredible. He never saw Matilda. He actually died. We went down to Melbourne where he died, and I had Matilda. Matilda had just been born, and we didn't know how sick he was. And I went and saw him one day, didn't take the kids in, was going to go back the next day, and that was it. And so that was a bit unfortunate. But in the whole scheme of things, and what that then allowed me to do, because as I said, I was in that private equity world and I was gearing up for an exit, and this happens. Yeah. And so we're talking about an 18-month period where this all was culminating. And as I said, it was that one night that made me change everything, when it all kind of came together.
Yeah. And so as you're such a circle of life moment, which in my own life and the life of a lot of clients that I've had the privilege of working with, it's usually something that's deep and personal that creates meaningful change in the direction that you're taking professionally. Not always, but most of the time. And there's some similarity there in the stories. And that when I remember becoming a dad, and because I didn't have a dad and I didn't always have the best examples in my life, I had this fear lifelong that, oh man, I never had a good role model. I don't know what that looks like. What if I become a dad and I somehow become one of the things that I didn't think were good, about father? I'm so nervous about that. And I remember an much older guy who was a big mentor in my life, just sort of quietly listened to me. And he said, the fact that you're asking that question and are concerned about it likely indicates that you're going to be just fine. And I just remember when I held my son the first time, my oldest, I remember looking into his eyes, and I ended up doing this. This was organic, but then I ended up doing it with all my kids. I sort of took them off while they're tending to mom and looked into his eyes and just had a conversation with him and sort of introduced myself and made a promise to him. And the darndest thing, Nick, was that at that moment, I didn't expect this. So many of those questions that I'd always had were answered right away. And what was interesting was some of the questions sort of buttressed into my professional life. What is my meaning? What I should be doing? Some of those questions got answered when I met my son and became a father, because my identity, shifted just like that. From, okay, I now see the world through the eyes of a father, which is a different way to look at the world than what I had before. And so there's a level of, I'm here to serve and to try to help others become the best version, whatever it is that they want to become, that I have. And I see a lot of that in the way that, you interact with people. So that's it's a beautiful story. I appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, no, I didn't realize about your dad either. I think there is definitely, what's that famous saying? The things that don't kill you make you stronger. But I think it's also the idea that they serve you in different ways that are not always apparent. And I think sometimes the most conflicted people are the ones that things show up for all of us, right? And you can look at them in whatever way you want to look at them. If you always see the negative in things, you end up in what I call the prison for a long time. Yeah. Right. As soon as Tony Robbins said another thing recently when I took my daughter to his last UPW in New York, he said the big thing is you've got to look at everything that you expect, and you've got to turn your expectations into appreciation. And, if you look at all the expectations and you get conflicted, if you appreciate what you've got, then that changes the whole, back to your idea, it changes everything in terms of how you see it.
Absolutely. And it's funny on your website and in the conversations we've had before, that's actually another thing that we share in terms of the way you try to describe to owners what the real issue is that they're facing. And you use the word, prison. I've heard you use handcuffs before too. And my upcoming book is called Escape from Keyman's Prison, because that's the best way that I could figure out how to articulate that for most founders, you end up creating of your own doing. You build this prison around yourself that you're not sure how to escape from, and you likely never intended to be in the first place. And then you're just stuck there because you're so important to whatever parts of the business there are. And you're so close to it that you don't know how to get out. And then, someone like yourself or me, who's just kind of been there, seen it enough times, comes in and says, well, look, you may not need to exit your business in the way that you think. You may not need to sell it to private equity. We may be able to what if we just solve this problem? And usually they're just sort of incredulous looking at you like, well, that's not possible. It's sort of like, well, hold my Monster Energy drink. I think we might be able to do it. But, what are some things that when you work with folks, and I know that you have worked with folks in many different industries, and right now you're primarily focused on working with founders in that B2B space who are really scaling and growing. And I love the way that you're doing it. But what are some common things that you see, for the benefit of the listeners that folks could actively look at and say, yeah, that resonates, and that's something that I could work on as well?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I just want to, there's a bit of a sick sense of humor that I have at times.
Yeah.
And how
we're friends, Nick.
Yeah. You're talking about the prison. So I launched this assessment. It's called the scale test.
Oh,
but it measures a business, if you like, against 4 different things. So one thing is its level of control, its assets, its growth, and its efficiency. But of course, if you put those letters together, it spells cage.
I love it.
It's the scale test, but it's really escaping the cage.
I love it.
It's quite funny.
I love it.
But yeah, I think as I've gone through this journey, the thing that I really appreciate is the idea that I have been on that side of the table doing these kind of deals pretty aggressively, buying low to sell high, taking advantage of the value that these entrepreneurs create. And now I've seen all the other nuances from the other side. So you can it's interesting when you've played both for both
Yes.
teams. So to answer your question, I find that people, first and foremost, people kind of start this entrepreneurial journey and there are different flavors of freedom, meaning people do it because they want to have some sense of that.
Yeah.
But they can't really define that very well. And often, and we talked about this before pressing record, an exit is one outcome, right, but it may not be the outcome that's the best for you. And you have to kind of go through solving some, let's call it smaller issues or challenges that probably feel like big challenges, but they're smaller challenges before you can really define whether that's the goal. And so as I kind of look at it, I say, if you have a business that's doing pretty well, and this is the big shift. I work with businesses that are going through the transition of startup to scale up. Yeah. And they're usually breaking through 7 figures of revenue. So they've already built a good business. They're not like trying to find product market fit. They've got the resemblance of a small team, all of those things. But here's the thing. The business owners that I work with tend to still try and run the business as it's trying to scale like it was when they started it.
Yes.
And everything fails. Okay? And here's the reason, because you can't get away from complexity when you're scaling. You can't, the idea is you're going to have more people, you're going to have more customers, you're going to have more processes, you're going to have more metrics, all these things, more complexity, right? So here's the real secret. The people who can survive that appreciate the fact that that's what's going to happen. And they start to understand that, simplification is the ultimate sophistication when they're trying to scale. Yeah. And that's the big shift. So to land that plane, 2 things. One is you have to remove yourself as the bottleneck. And there's this really interesting concept that I learned from Dan Sullivan. I had him on my podcast a few days ago. And he said, you know what the shift is, Nick? The shift is you have to go from being in control to being in charge. And I said, that's interesting. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, control, right? Grabbing something and having to wrestle it to the ground. He said, that's one way of doing things, but you're never going to scale if you do that. But if you're in charge, you're sitting at the expansive view of 30,000 feet and you can see the wood for the trees. You make different decisions. So the first piece is you've got to remove yourself as the bottleneck, and there's ways around that, which we can get into if you want to. And the second thing is you've got to make enough money, right, to support any of the objectives. They could be personal income objectives, they could be growth objectives, but you've got to focus on profit. You've got to focus on cash flow. So I often say if you can solve the cash flow challenge and you can solve the bottleneck challenge, you may not ever want to sell your business.
Absolutely.
And that's the big epiphany I think people have to appreciate, even though you and I will talk about exits, but it's an exit without selling potentially.
It's the definition of an exit. That's the thing, is that there's the common misunderstanding. I mean, the number one way people are surprised if they speak with me on a personal level about whatever they're doing is that I never push anybody towards what the modern definition of an exit is, that most people talk about, which is an exit to PE. For some, that makes a lot of sense and it can be a great thing to do. But to me, exit simply means you yourself, whatever it looks like as a founder, have exited yourself from being overly dependent, others being dependent upon you for the day-to-day of the business. And what's really interesting that Dan said that is most of the work that I do, you do it long enough and you figure out, I don't know if this is your experience, but it's sort of the mini version of the hero's journey with a founder, where they generally start a business and it grows initially because they themselves are so uniquely gifted at something that, the business grows and people want to work with them to do it, especially in the B2B space, service space, whatever that is. But the darndest thing is you reach capacity pretty quickly in that space. And if you want to continue to grow, you are literally limited by the sheer number of things you can do in a day. And in order to grow past that friction point, you then have to begin allowing other people to handle bits and pieces of that. The issue there is who you had to be possibly from when you started to that point, and then who you need to be from that point moving forward fundamentally changes, because you go from being a doer of many things, any and everything, a 5-tool player in baseball parlance, to suddenly you need to become really good at building other people up and giving away control. And for a lot of us who start off the doer, that's a really hard transition because there's identity involved.
Yep. Indeed.
And so it's a really challenging thing, I think, for people to make that transition. But the beautiful thing is, if you can do it and you get to that point, functionally, you have already exited in many ways. And then you have a decision that you can make that gives you tremendous freedom, because then you're not, and here's the other piece that very few people talk about. I can't tell you how many folks that I either have personally worked with or have talked to after, who I did not work with, who did exit in the traditional way, and they exited to PE. And something really unexpected happened to them fairly shortly after they made that exit, which was that they found themselves in this sort of odd pit of discomfort and despair. And it wasn't about money usually. They had all the money they thought they wanted and maybe did a few things that they had on a bucket list of, let me get a car, let me go on this vacation, let me get a house, whatever it was. Once those things are done, there can be an emptiness that sets in, and a just sense of, I don't feel right. And they usually can't describe it. And what it is that who they were in their core was so tied to that business and what they were doing that when it's no longer true and they no longer have it, you end up with this sort of entrepreneurial anxiety or depression. And sometimes, not always, that's when poor decisions can get made. And you see people flow, there's a magnified version of that with lottery winners. It's different. Business owners tend to be a little bit more.
I had someone on my podcast who's done 3 9-figure exits who talked about this exact point.
Really?
And it was an interesting conversation about depression, however you define depression, right, without kind of getting too political about it. But the idea, it makes sense when you think about it, right? Because, it's the whole we're both fathers, kids are getting older. I think it happens both to mothers and fathers, but certainly there's this identity shift of, when the kids leave home, right?
I'm getting anxiety just thinking about that.
because our identity has been fathers for a long part of our life, and we've loved the journey, right? So I think there's a few things that happen when you really enjoy something, or you set an intention and it gets achieved, or whatever that is. There's a sense of loss, when
Yeah.
that's not there anymore. So there's that. Then you've got I am my business. So how many times when you go to a party and someone says, "Oh, hi, what do you do?"
Yeah.
I'm a whatever I am, right? So
Especially
that,
men.
yeah, and the famous thing, right? What the I am statement, right? Whatever you say after I am has huge consequences to everything.
Yeah.
If I am a failure, I am successful, I am whatever, right? So if I am a gym owner, or I am an accountant, or whatever the thing is, and you've said that for 20 or 30 years and you're not anymore, it's going to be lost. So I think this is in my book coming out. The last chapter is defined around this particular thing. You could argue in my book I could have started the bloody thing with it because it's called Exit for Millions, and I unapologetically am talking about selling your business for a lot of money, right? The book is definitely about that, but I finish it by saying, you got to be careful, right? Because if your next act or whatever we call that is not defined, I can teach you how to create an 8 to 9 figure payday here, right? That's what I know how to do. But if you don't understand you through this, you're going to sabotage it either directly or indirectly, and either before or after any transaction happens.
Yes. Yes. And it's the fact that you just said before is fascinating, because as someone who's spent a large part of my career being the one who handles the push towards that exit and negotiating it, I've never talked about this on a podcast before, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen a seller unconsciously straight up assassinate their chances of an exit.
It happens.
And sabotage it. And to the point where you look at it as the neutral third party and go, what are you doing? But, as a father and as husband, as a man who does my own, reflection, you start to understand, okay, this person reached a point of deep discomfort that they couldn't articulate, and they just, did the human thing. And they started to, subconscious gets in and says, well, if we muck this up enough, it won't happen. And then the thing that we're the most afraid of won't happen. And then we can always tell ourselves, well, it would have been fine if this and this. But that sabotage is very real.
There's a little secret I'll tell you, which I think is quite amusing, that we used to use in private equity. And when you're kind of getting through the deal, and there's a kind of emotional attachment that's happening through the rapport that's going on. And remember, when you're in the final stages of kind of heavy due diligence, there's quite a lot of investment.
Yeah.
There's a dinner that happens, and the dinner is the let your guard down dinner. And it's interesting what it's used as a positioning technique and tool and everything else. It's designed to look like a rapport build. Hey, we're almost there. Let's have dinner. Let's kind of have a few drinks. But it's really the final assessment. And I can't tell you the number of times the owner gets absolutely blotto, right? Gets stupidly drunk and does something stupid. And I always thought it's they've let their guard down too early. They kind of think the deal's done, sort of thing. But now I've learned to appreciate what they're really doing is potentially sabotaging it.
Yes.
Because they're out of control, back to our control and in charge. They've lost control. And in a situation like that, they don't think clearly.
Yeah.
And their emotional state gets the better of them. But interesting, isn't it? So these are,
it is.
You're right. Like this, what's funny about talking about exits and M&A and deals, everyone always gravitates towards numbers, right? EBITDA and balance sheets and all that. But I think the psychological and the nuances of all the kind of what you see, how people are and how they change, that's the thing that I think is really the way I'm so kind of obsessed with this kind of world, other than it's core to my purpose and mission these days, is it's just so interesting.
It is. Yeah. I agree with you. And in candid moments, over an old fashioned, I talk about that a lot with folks in the industry, which is that, look, that I've never woken up a day in my life and gotten excited by commas and zeros ever. It's a means to an end, and it's the byproduct of hopefully a job well done and having the right people in the right place. But what does fascinate me and gets me going in the morning is the human nature of it and the psychology behind it and why we do certain things and what happens if you put this personality with these other personalities and what can be accomplished or what can be destroyed. And how people behave when stress is on versus when it's not. And That's the piece. You're right. In negotiations, you could really, many have, but you could write an entire book. I'm going to an event soon, and the keynote at this little tiny event is going to be Dr. Cialdini.
Oh,
And
fantastic. I love his book. I
he's
mean,
great.
Influence was one of, in fact, I only have a few books over here, which I
Is that one
reference
of
all
them?
the time. Yeah, it's still, I think, one of the best books in terms of, well, actually, I used to use it for negotiation and selling, but it's fantastic.
Well, so you look at a guy like that who is, a professor at some of the top universities in the world in psychology, and it'd be easy to ask yourself, like, why would that guy be writing business books? And people have asked me, my undergraduate degree was in clinical psychology. The joke is always like, oh, do you feel like, you sort of wasted that since you don't get to use it? And I always laugh a little bit because it's sort of like, look, I use that part of my education far more than my original major, which was finance, that I got rid of after my freshman year because it was so tedious and boring. And then what I did was I learned human nature because it was more interesting to me. And then the rest of it, when I don't know something these days, especially, I just go on YouTube,
Or
to this day, every now and then something will pop up on a balance sheet that I'm like, I'm not 100% sure what the hell that means.
Well, you can put balance sheets into Claude AI these days, and they do assessments for you. It's fantastic.
Does it for you.
And they're good. So, so these days, I think it's more absolutely about the skills that you have to understand how people make decisions and how there's the kind of emotional side and the practical side and how the brain works and NLP and all those. I think those things are fascinating because they've served me well in my sort of deal making career anyway. But it was another level when I was in private equity because you're just trained to operate and think in a certain way. And one thing I will say is, as much of this conversation today has been about, I suppose, the good side of what we both collectively believe and try and do, certainly for business owners, but I still love the thrill of the hunt.
Of course.
Like, if you ask me what's my favorite thing is still taking an 8-figure business owner and getting them an 8 or 9-figure exit and going into the game. And I suppose it's the saying, you can't take the player out the game, right?
No. Same. It's for me, I know exactly, I'm the same, and I know exactly why that is. The reason for me that is because, one, I was made, for whatever reason, I was made and created to help other people become the best version of themselves. That's really what I was made. I figured that out, years ago. And the other part of it is that I was an athlete for a very long time, and it was a huge part of my life. And that competitive environment and juice and spirit that you get from football, baseball, wrestling, whatever it is, when you lose that, you get older and the body breaks down and you're really not good enough to become a professional athlete by any stretch of the imagination. When you lose that juice, something has to replace it. And for some people, it's something that maybe isn't healthy. And I just lucked my way into finding something that gives me a representation of that juice and energy and that competitive spirit and environment that I can do for a long time because it's not dependent upon my body breaking down. So I think if you're a competitive person, like my kids, our family, we really can't play board games together, Nick. It's a sad thing, but we can't play board games together because everyone, including my wife, who, if you met her, she's one of the sweetest people you have ever met in your life. But if you put our family or she and I in a competitive situation, it gets ugly because all of us want to win. All of us think the other person's taking liberties and cheating. And it's just sort of a thing that we have in our family. And instead of looking at that and saying, oh, it's kind of unhealthy, we're just sort of like, look, this is who we are. And so like it's this industry and finding the ways to help people win, especially when if you can find that one thing, and usually there's always one thing that you can find that will so disproportionately impact everything else positively, whether it's the business and what's driving the business and its growth and revenue, or it's the person that's running the business. There's usually one thing that you got to do other things, but there's usually one thing that you can grab onto and improve that will make such a big difference that everything else becomes sort of tangential to the conversation. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, it's, I think sometimes you can call it like a big domino. There is a certain thing that you can push that's going to have a massive impact or effect.
Yeah.
I often find that it's the person. So
agreed.
So, I often, if I go in to do any kind of mentoring or advisory, and I say this very transparently, I say, we need to look at you, we need to look at the team, we need to look at the business. And somewhere within those three things, we're going to find the answer or multiple kind of answers, because we're going to be going deep into those areas. I had a conversation with one of my clients today, had an outstanding year, like incredible. And it was really nice to have that conversation as we end this year. And I said to him, I said, do you realize how much you've changed? And he said, you know what? He said, my wife said that to me last week. And I said, you don't recognize it?
And that's the mirror, by the way.
Yes, it is. Exactly. And
the wife is always the mirror.
And they've just had another child and all that sort of stuff. So he's been home quite a bit. And I said, what does she say? And he just said, I'm just so much calmer. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, because I don't feel like this thing that I've created is just running away from it now. I realize, and I said, but we haven't really changed much. You know, we've kind of got a bit of a team in there. We've got a better plan, right? More clarity on the plan. And he goes, yeah, but I didn't realize that those things would change me so much. So that's why it's like, you know, you might have to change something in the business to create it. But I often find it, if a business owner has clarity and certainty and, you know, belief and confidence, all the other things become fixable. And if that person doesn't have that, and you can't, even in our roles, which it sounds weird talking about this maybe for some people, but for you and I, it's very natural, right? If you can't come in as the most trusted advisor and affect that with the person, very rarely do you get a great outcome.
So rare. And it would be people are always so surprised when I tell them that it's a bit like the meme of what people think I do, what my parents think I do, what my friends think I do, and what I do. It's half the time or more. The conversations that I have with clients that I work with have absolutely, at least topically, nothing to do with their business and everything to do with them as a human being and what's going on in their life and how to handle the different things that come at us as a father or mother, a husband or a wife, or friends, the way that we show up in the world. There's a lot of time that I end up, and early on in my career, that surprised even me, that I'm having so many more conversations that don't directly have anything to do with business, but then you do it long enough and you realize, oh no, this is the thing that allows this person to grow.
Yeah, it is. And that's, I think, the surprising thing about, you know, we're talking on a show here that people will expect it to go deep into the permutations of deal making.
Yeah.
But deal making, what's the thing that everyone says? The number one skill in deal making is rapport and understanding someone and that empathetic view. And I just find that's the construct of business. And the other thing I think that's interesting as I spend time with these founders and you start to really get to know them and become friends with them, is that you start to understand that everything that defines their journey to date and therefore starts to impact where they're going to be going is that identity piece that you raised previously. And I said very, very early on when I started Scale Up Your Business, I said something which resonated with people, which is you can only scale a business and, in fact, your life to the level of your identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And your ability to dream, you know, it gets a little woo-woo, which I don't normally do, but I have it in me. And I think that we're only limited.
We're not having any old fashions or Negronis at this point, JB.
No,
so, this could be like a fireside chat.
It really should. But I really do believe that human beings are mostly limited by our own ability to dream of what we're capable of. And I love that you've done a lot of work with Tony. He certainly over years has been, a mentor of mine, mostly with mindset things and processing, but with business owners, some of the dearest friends that I have in my life. I mean, people who, if they called me at 2:00 in the morning and they needed something, I would not only answer, but I would go out of my way to do whatever I could, and the same back and forth. The reason I think that those people become dear friends of mine is because this is a strange analogy, but I think building and scaling a business at whatever size it is, truly, it's a bit of a knife fight. And why do I say a knife fight specifically? Well, if you've ever been in a regular fight of any kind, it can be pretty one-sided. But here's the thing. In a knife fight, even if you win, you are not going to escape without some cuts. Absolutely no chance that you're going to escape that fight without you yourself taking some damage. And I think that there's a parallel with being in business and growing businesses and being all the things to all the people that rely upon you and to bring the value that you have to your customers, the people that work with you. And I have such a heart for those people because only someone who's done it can really understand what it's like and what it feels like to lay awake at night and try to think about hitting, payroll numbers and the things that you need to do for your customers and the way that you're growing and maybe all the 10 ways that you don't feel like you're good enough to be able to continue doing this, but you figure it out anyway. And that's a knife fight. And so those are my people. I know that they're yours, and the shared heart that we have for being of any value that we possibly can for those people, along with our identities as dads and husbands and fans of the Boston Celtics, I think is my
Can't miss out on the Boston Celtics. So.
That's it, my friend. Well, hey, I want to end with this. Most of you know me well enough to know, if you've listened, that I don't really believe in competition in the way that most people do. And that, to me, if there's someone who's doing the same thing I do or something similar to what I do, but they're just fantastic and they're a good person and they do it the right way, I absolutely want you to talk to those people and I want you to consider working with them. And you are one of those people. So who are you working with right now? What's an ideal person to reach out to Nick Bradley and say, Nick, I really like what you said on that podcast. I like how can I work with you? Who are you wanting to work with?
Yeah, I appreciate your kind of the way that you operate in these things as well. And my view is always that there is so many people out there that need people like us.
We can't do it.
Exactly. Yeah. So as you said earlier, my kind of sweet spot, if you like, where I sort of really shine is B2B. If you want to go even deeper, it's B2B services. I've worked with agencies and consultancies, education businesses, all those sort of things. I love the purity of that model, right? Where it's easy to scale. You can kind of get into it, the value propositions and the business models and things like that. There's lots of ways you can be creative around it. I love all that sort of stuff. So I work with the founders of those businesses. Generally, they've reached that 7-figure of revenue. I like to say the starting point is that. The ending point is usually some sort of 8 or 9-figure valuation. Yeah. And I say the word valuation on the premise that, we could sell to private equity if you want to do that. But if you've got a business that's worth that level, right, you've created a pretty damn good business. So you're going to get freedom from whatever exit you choose.
Yes.
And these days I work in 2 different ways. I work with business owners who are at that sort of 7-figure revenue, but they want to get to 7-figure profit. So I call that the scaling phase. So they're not ready for a big sort of exit event to private equity, but they definitely want to build a better business for them. And then I work with the business owners that get past that 7-figure net profit EBITDA. And usually those ones there, we are going for it. We are going to go for a big 8 or 9-figure exit. That's the game plan. There's no ambiguity. And at that point, it's a very, very different type of advisory or mentoring engagement that I have with them. But, both are fun. I enjoy both, but they're the 2 ways that I do it.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, family man, business scale expert, all around great guy with a lovely accent, my friend Nick Bradley. You can find him at highvalueexit.com.
That's correct.
And also, you can listen to his podcast, Scale Up with Nick Bradley. He's got some wonderful guests, and he was kind enough to have me on his show a while back, and he's got some, I just actually looked, and you've got some that I need to catch up on, because you've had some pretty heavy hitters that are fascinating with something to say on there.
Love it. Thanks very much, JB. Always a pleasure, sir.
All right.